What's going on, football fans? Today I'm coming at you guys with a video I've been really excited to get out here for quite some time now. It's my first episode, an installment of the Dynasty Deep Dive series. So today I'm going to be going over the first 8 rounds of my Dynasty startup draft that I did a couple weeks ago, back on the 1st of August. And I'm going to be explaining each move I made and my strategy going into the draft and how it turned out coming out the other end. So with that, let's get going. Alright, so before we get started too far here, there's one thing that I need to explain to you guys, and that is this pick right here. So here is my team technically for the first 8 rounds had I stayed in position for all of my picks. However, I ended up making a trade prior to the start of the draft, and I traded this 1.5 pick right here where Alvin Kamara went, and I ended up exchanging it for the 212 right here, the 3-1, and down here the 612. So I got 3 picks in return for my 5th overall pick. So you can basically subtract these 3 players, DJ Moore, Jonathan Taylor, and Deebo Samuel, from the team at the 1.1 spot, and you can add Alvin Kamara to their team, and then add those 3 onto my team, obviously. So I technically netted 10 players in the first 8 rounds. So just off the bat, that's pretty dang good. I'm very happy with how that turned out. So without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so at the top of the draft, I had 2 things in mind that I knew that I wanted to leave the draft with. I wanted 2 to 3 running backs that I felt confident in going forward, not only this year, but in the next 2 to 3 seasons, that I felt could be workhorse running backs for me, because I know how difficult this year especially it is, and it's probably only going to get more difficult to find those RB1s and those guys who can really carry your team on a week-to-week basis. So going into the draft, the guy I had on my radar for who would actually be my top running back on the board at this 1.5 spot was actually Alvin Kamara, and that's exactly where he went. However, I didn't want to invest that pick into him in Dynasty because while I think he'll be great for me this season, I have some question marks about he hasn't received a second contract yet. Additionally, Kamara has had some struggles with nagging injuries, and while it's not really a huge issue, I just wasn't comfortable picking him at the 1.5, and I thought I would rather have more players with potential upside rather than one guy who I'm kind of laying my whole future onto. So that's why I chose to make the trade. You can see here in the end, essentially the trade was Alvin Kamara for DJ Moore, Jonathan Taylor, and Deebo Samuel. And from my perspective, I loved the trade. I think it was extremely beneficial for my lineup, and it will help me for years to come. I think that for right now, it's probably going to be more beneficial to the team who got Kamara because they'll have a top RB in their lineup. However, I think that going forward, Jonathan Taylor, who I ended up picking, is going to be fantastic. DJ Moore is a franchise receiver, and Deebo Samuel is a nice piece to have in and out of your lineup on a weekly basis. So with that being said, I didn't have a selection until the 8th pick of the 2nd round. So that sounds like quite a long time, but I actually got the player that I had at the top of my board for who I wanted at that spot. I was kind of hoping for a slip of Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Josh Jacobs. However, I thought it was highly unlikely that they would still be there, and I kind of thought that it wasn't going to happen. So Miles Sanders was the guy that I was realistically hoping for at that spot, and I was extremely happy when he fell there at the 2.8. Miles Sanders is a guy who I think has the potential to score just as many points as Alvin Kamara in fantasy this year. Sanders has the backfield essentially to himself, besides maybe losing some passing volume from Boston Scott being there. I think that Sanders is going to get the goal line touches. There's no real power back there to take the spots from him or the carries from him. So I don't think you have to worry about having a limited ceiling because of that. Even though Scott is going to take some receiving work from Sanders, I still think that Sanders is going to have a tremendous role receiving from Carson Wentz and in that Eagles offense. I don't have any worries about the production that Sanders will see or the amount of volume that he's going to get, and I don't necessarily think he needs 20 touches a game if that's what you're hung up on about Sanders because of how efficient he is on the field. Sanders has breakaway burst, and we saw multiple times last year down the stretch when he took over, when Jordan Howard got hurt, that he can make explosive plays happen, and he can do it in a flash. So Miles Sanders is a guy I'm completely investing into in all my leagues this year, and especially in this league as my top pick in a Dynasty league. I think that Miles Sanders is better than some of the RBs that went in the first round, to be honest. If I was picking at the back end of the the first round, I'd say from picks 9 to the end of the first round, I would have taken Sanders there regardless. So I'm really happy walking away with Sanders in the second round, and I don't have much concern at all. The only issue I would have is I would try to get Boston Scott on your roster just in case something does happen to him, because with injuries or if COVID somehow, if Miles Sanders gets COVID, I could see that being an issue for me because he's my RB1 this year, and there's really no one in competition on my roster for that RB1 spot other than him. I think that you just need handcuffs this year just to play it safe, and I don't think that Sanders has any risks other than that. So maybe if you wanted Scott as a handcuff, otherwise I'm completely riding with Miles Sanders this season. So that was my first pick. Moving over here to the 212, I selected DJ Moore, Panthers wide receiver, going into his third season. Moore is a guy that I picked as a floor play who is extremely young. I believe he's only 23 years old, and I think he has all the potential in the world to be a wide receiver one for my lineup going forward. DJ Moore he made Kyle Allen look great to start the season last year, and Kyle Allen was getting high praise until the analysts realized that it was kind of what he was working with McCaffrey and Moore. Even some Curtis Samuel in there was making Allen look good, because we saw that once the season went on and there was tape on Allen started to struggle and the arm talent just wasn't there. He has some flashes, but he's not really a physically imposing quarterback in the sense that his arm talent isn't great. He had some kind of noodle arm throws, and Moore would just go up and make ridiculous catches on the ball. And I was extremely happy to get Moore at the 212. I think he is a guy who I could have in my lineup for potentially 5 or 6 years, and he'll just be a stud each and every week. He had only 4 touchdowns, I believe, in 2019, and he still finished as a top 20 wide receiver in a terrible offense that was pretty much Christian McCaffrey and nobody else. DJ Moore is a guy that I am extremely high on in 2020. I think that if he can put it all together, Moore is going to be maybe a top 12 wide receiver and will be in that wide receiver 1 territory going forward. So I wouldn't hesitate at all to take Moore in dynasty startups. I think Moore's a guy who provides consistency for me in my lineup, and not only this year, but I think going forward his ceiling will continue to grow, and Moore really has the potential to be a high-end receiver in fantasy. I don't think there's any risk with him. Teddy Bridgewater is going to be an upgrade over Kyle Allen, so I think that Moore's numbers can only go up, and if the touchdowns go up, so will his production for fantasy points. And just based off of where he finished last year with only 4 touchdowns, he has all the potential in the world going forward. Moving into my next pick here at the 3-1, I picked a guy who a lot of people in my league thought I was reaching for, and I got a lot of oohs and gasps, and that's Jonathan Taylor. And I picked Jonathan Taylor with the sole purpose of picking him for next year. Jonathan Taylor is a guy that I think has the potential next year to be a top-tier RB, and he could finish as an RB1. In that Colts offense, he has the potential to score 10 to 12 touchdowns behind that offensive line and get 250 to 300 touches. I mean, I think Marlon Mack is on his way out the door. Mack is good because he can do his job, and that Colts offensive line really bolsters his production. I think that a true runner like Taylor, who can punish defenders and just carry the rock without injury issues, is a guy that the Colts will value highly and just feed the ball to. So I think that Jonathan Taylor, for why I drafted him, he wasn't a reach at all for me. I think that he is a true workhorse and should be valued like one, because next year in Dynasty, I could see him going as a top 5 pick. So to get him in the 3rd round, for me, I see huge return on investment, big ROI, and he's a guy that I'm not necessarily playing him for this year. I am mainly playing for next season and going forward. And this team as a whole this is a dynasty league. So I pick my players keeping in mind that I don't want to just be competitive this year, but I want to be competitive going forward. And I don't really want to be in those big tank droughts where I have to just be awful for a season to get the top pick and then pray that guy pans out. I want a team that's going to be consistent and a team that's going to carry through season to season and provide consistency, and I'll be in the mix every single season. Moving to my fourth pick, in the first 3 rounds, I selected A.J. Brown, the Tennessee wide receiver. A.J. Brown was absolutely insane with the ball in his hands last season. He was making DBs look silly, and he was just punishing players after the catch. He is like the Derrick Henry equivalent of wide receivers. Like, he is massive and just runs guys over and breaks tackles like it's nobody's business. He only had 52 catches last year, and he went over 1,000 yards with those receptions, and he did it on, I believe, 82 or 80 targets. The guy is crazy efficient, and he has the potential to be a generational wide receiver, in my opinion, that is just going to bully DBs until his physical prime is over and just be a fantasy monster. Many fantasy players are highly questioning whether Brown will be able to sustain the efficiency and fantasy production that he had in 2019. However, I'm just not in that boat because the Titans just put Corey Davis on the PUP list. I can't remember what the exact reason was. He might have had corona, but Brown is going to see an uptick in his targets this season, and with those targets, his efficiency it has to come down because it was so ridiculously high last season. But the amount of extra targets that he's going to receive will make up for that, and he will see an increase in production, and overall he will be possibly even a better fantasy player this season. So I see zero issue with taking Brown in the 3rd round of a redraft league or in Dynasty. I think that he holds tremendous value and can potentially be a league winner if he continues to be just as efficient, because if he gets more and more targets than he saw last season and continues to be a highly efficient receiver, he's going to get in the end zone a lot, and he's going to have a lot of big plays. So I can't get enough of A.J. Brown this year, and for Dynasty, the fact that I get to keep him makes me extremely happy. Moving into the 4th round, so if you watched my last video, my half PPR mock draft, I explained my desire to get a top-tier tight end because I hate the headache of trying to decide what tight end I want to start in my lineup every week. I feel like it makes me feel at peace when I have a tight end that is the guy for me, and I don't have to worry about starting someone else other than on their bye week. And that's what I got in the 4th round with Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is a guy who's only 23 years old, and he barely played on the Ravens passing snaps last year. On snaps where the Ravens threw the football, Mark Andrews on the field for less than 50% of the time, and that was due to Hayden Hurst being in town. But now that he's out of there, Mark Andrews is going to see a lot more passing work, and he's going to be on the field for a lot more plays. So Mark Andrews is a guy who, again, like A.J. Brown, was very efficient last season, and he got in the end zone a bunch. Mark Andrews being tied to a guy like Lamar Jackson is also great for his fantasy value because of how dynamic he is and the ability it gives his receivers to get open down the field when he's improving. And I see Mark Andrews in Dynasty as a potential. He could potentially be the tight end one for the next few years. George Kittle is no question the most well-rounded tight end in football, but he might not necessarily be the best receiving tight end in football. There's no question that when you consider the receiving game and the blocking game, George Kittle is by far the best tight end in the NFL. I would say that for this season, I have Travis Kelce finishing as my tight end one, and then I would say Kittle could be somewhere in that 2 to 3 mix, right there with Mark Andrews. I think the efficiency of Andrews and the touchdowns just make him a fantasy monster, and it's really going to be hard for someone else, even like a Zach Ertz or Darren Waller, to beat him out in fantasy for scoring this year. Moving on to the 5th round, I picked my first rookie of the draft, and that was Cam Akers. Now, I was a lot higher on Cam Akers than most. As you can see, I picked Cam Akers before DeAndre Swift and J.K. Dobbins, who I am both big fans of. I prefer Swift over Dobbins, but still, Cam Akers is a guy who, despite this league being half PPR scoring, I think still has the potential to outscore a guy like DeAndre Swift, who is going to see more passing work than Akers. I can see Akers in Sean McVay's scheme taking a healthy share of screen passes, but I don't know if he'll be quite as effective of a receiver as Todd Gurley was. But the main draw for me about Akers was that Todd Gurley factor, and the idea that Sean McVay has had a legitimate RB1 workhorse in his scheme gives me all the faith in the world that a guy as talented as Cam Akers could potentially be a 20 touch per game guy and be falling in the end zone a lot. I know that the Rams' offensive line is in shambles, but adding those 12 personnel sets that they were in at the back half of the year last season with Everett and Higbee gives me more faith that the Rams can effectively block for him and takes away a little bit of my concern with him. So that's why I ended up taking Akers a little earlier than others. In a redraft league, obviously you're not picking Cam Akers this high, but seeing that I'm projecting this down the road, that's why I took Akers in the 5th round. Obviously, like we see Melvin Gordon here going the next pick after him, I would take Melvin Gordon every day in a redraft league before Akers, but projecting this for the future, I couldn't pass on Akers' potential, and I just felt like I needed another RB in my lineup like Taylor, who I think can be extremely effective next season and going forward. All right, coming back to me in the 6th round with the 8th pick, I selected DJ Chark, and Chark was a guy who I was absolutely thrilled that was on the board with this selection. Chark was amazing last season. He was, I believe, wide receiver 6 or 8. I can't recall which one it was, but he was right up there in the top fantasy wide receiver tiers before he started to suffer from a little bit of injuries last season. He was stretching the field with Gardner Minshew last year, and he was making big plays happen left and right, and he got in the end zone a healthy amount too. He's a very young guy, and with Jay Gruden coming to town, I just couldn't pass on Chark. Even over a guy like Tyler Lockett, I just think that the long-term connection there in Jacksonville and that bad defense especially is going to give Chark an opportunity to be really effective and maybe even surpass those fantasy numbers that we saw from him last season. I think that Chark is a guy that I feel really, really strongly about. Maybe even more so than other guys like Akers and Taylor. Like, I think those are players that I'm projecting in the future to be fantastic and elite level fantasy players. But I feel even more strongly about DJ Chark being a guy who is already solidified as the wide receiver 1 in his offense, and a guy that is just going to be a fantasy star for years to come. I think that DJ Chark is 100% low-risk player and a very, very high-reward player in fantasy football. Then my last pick from that trade I made for the 1.5 pick, I took Deebo Samuel. And Samuel is a guy that I'm not extremely high on, but he's got enough upside for me to the point where I wanted to draft him. And being a second-year player and seeing how he performed last season, I really like the way he plays. As a fantasy prospect, I really like him because he has big play burst, and he almost plays to me like his style reminds me of a running back. And you almost see that because Shanahan gives him these end-around plays, and I love the added fantasy value that he gets from those. He broke a few of those away and scored touchdowns on them last year, so he gets some nice added value from rushing attempts. And added with the fact that he just had some big play catches last season, I think that Samuel is a guy who has really high upside, and I just couldn't avoid drafting him in the end of the 6th round. I thought the value there was too good to pass on, and I'm happy with what I came away with that pick. As I'm recording this video, I just got a notification from Sleeper Fantasy. Well, shout out to them using their software again for this video. I got a notification saying that Jonathan Taylor is literally running through defenders at training camp. So that's something I love to hear, and I couldn't be more excited to hear that he is doing fantastic at training camp, and I can't wait to see him play on the field this year. All right, coming back in the 7th round, I went running back again because I felt like I really needed to fill out my running back core because I saw too many opportunities in the early part of the draft to take wide receivers that I felt like should have been taken earlier and held a lot of value. So I took Raheem Mostert for the 49ers here, and this was a pick where I had made quite a few picks prior in the draft that I was projecting players for next season and beyond. Raheem Mostert was a pick that I was taking for this season specifically. So obviously we all know Raheem Mostert went absolutely crazy at the end of last season and against my Packers tore us up for 200 plus yards and 4 touchdowns in the NFC Championship game, and he was absolutely on fire and couldn't be stopped. Mostert is 27 years old today, I believe, and honestly, I don't see him being a lead back for more than 2 seasons, counting this year. Because of his age and contract situation, I think that as soon as his contract runs out with the 49ers, no one else is going to want to pay him that money due to his age, even though he doesn't have the wear and tear and mileage on his legs already. But I'm picking Raheem Mostert specifically based off of what I think he could be this season. And I think that what that is the lead back for the 49ers. Now, I know Kyle Shanahan loves his running back by committee, and he loves to feed the hot hand, but I'm kind of taking a chance with this pick. I know that Mostert could be an absolute fantasy headache and could be an extremely boom-bust player, and I could get the short end of the stick with that one. But Mostert was a guy that I said, well, I need another running back for this season, so I need to just take a chance on a guy who could be an elite-level player this year, like a high running back 2, low-end running back 1, and see what happens. So that's why I took Mostert at the 7-5. I saw more upside with him than I did any other player at the running back position at this spot in the draft, so that's why I ended up taking him there. Finally, moving back to my 8th round pick, I ended up taking Patriots' second-year wide receiver N'Keal Harry. Now, Harry was a guy who many were extremely disappointed with in his rookie season in the NFL. He barely saw the field and made little to no impact for the Patriots. He had 1 nice touchdown catch, but that was about it. And mainly that was because I think that the Patriots run a very complex scheme for a rookie player. Tom Brady is extremely picky about his wideouts, and he wants their footwork and whatnot to be just so. So I think that Harry struggled as a rookie in his first year, and he just needed more time to develop. And on top of the fact that he missed the whole first part of the season with injury, I think that it was just a rough landscape for him in New England. Coming into his second season, though, with Cam Newton, I feel a lot better about Harry as a fantasy player because I see him playing the Kelvin Benjamin role that Cam Newton was so accustomed to in Carolina. Now, Harry, I think, has the potential to be much better than Benjamin because we saw him be good for one season and then kind of bust and tear his ACL, and he was never the same after that. But Newton has proved over the years that he loves the big body receivers and he loves to throw to them down in the red zone. And I see Harry taking over that role in New England. I think that between him, Edelman, and White, those are really the only fantasy players you want from the Patriots. And I see each of those three players potentially having a huge role in that offense. So I think that Harry is a guy who will put up lots of touchdowns this year and lots of big plays down the field. So I like the prospect of Harry, and he's a guy I don't necessarily have to start right away. But if he pans out for me at that pick, I think that he's an extremely valuable player to have. So, all right, that was the first 8 rounds of my Dynasty Startup Draft. So in the comments down below, let me know what you guys think about how it turned out. And if you would have taken anyone differently based off how the board played out, let me know what you guys think. Thank you guys so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next video. Make sure to go follow me on Instagram at Sizzle Fantasy Sports for daily graphics and analysis on fantasy players. And with that, I'll see you guys later. Peace.